Good morning. I begin with the Tuskegee song written by Paul Lawrence Dunbar. Tuskegee, the pride of the swift growing South, we pay thee our homage today. For the worth of thy teaching, the joy of thy care, and the good we have known neath thy sway. Long striving, diligent sons have daughters whose strength is their pride. We will love thee forever and ever shall walk through the oncoming years at thy side. I am Dr. Keturah Nix and bring you greetings from Cincinnati, Ohio, where I am an assistant professor of English specializing in African American literature at Xavier University. I am always home when talking about Booker T. Washington and Tuskegee University, or as us alumni affectionately call her, Mother Tuskegee. My presentation today looks at the literary inspirations of Booker T. Washington and Tuskegee Institute, as noted in the works of Harlem Renaissance author Langston Hughes. His focus on the literary relationship between Booker T. Washington and Langston Hughes spotlights an under-discussed area in the African American literary tradition. Today, we will hear how Hughes, once famously referred to as the poet laureate of the Negro race, was influenced by the legacy of Booker T. Washington and wrote about him and Tuskegee in poems, plays, and nonfiction, including editorial columns. Hughes would have been 14 years old when Washington passed away in 1915. However, we see an extension of Washington's legacy through the pen of Langston Hughes. My objective with this presentation is to foster conversation and deeper reflection about the significance of literature in commemoration and public memory. Analyzing Washington through the lens of Langston Hughes also invites audiences to consider the life perspectives of Hughes and his perception of Washington and Tuskegee. Essentially, what we have is the retelling of Washington's legacy through another person. This is often commemoration in its essence, a curated retelling through the lens of other people's creativity. The title of my presentation, Up from Literature, borrows from Booker T. Washington's 1901 seminal autobiography, Up from Slavery. I chose this title as a method to bridge the legacy of Washington to literature. Washington is often remembered for this rags to riches autobiography, which recounts his life growing up enslaved to becoming one of the most prominent race leaders and educators of the 20th century. To many, this narrative is the quintessential definition for achieving the American dream. Up from Slavery is canonized with the self-made man genre. Such narratives also include Benjamin Franklin, Andrew Carnegie, and Frederick Douglass. However, Washington deviates from these autobiographies before him by omitting his name from the title. Doing this created a universal experience that centralized the role of slavery in America's existence. Removing his personal identity from the title allows readers, Black or white, to see themselves in the text and identify their relationship to slavery while simultaneously offering himself as one example for moving forward. In 3 words, Washington focalizes chattel slavery in a way that forced America to face the perils of its past and connect it to the self-made ideal on which it is predicated. Washington reminded America and the world about the pivotal role African American people have had in the creation of the United States of America. So, how does Langston Hughes become part of Booker T. Washington's retelling? Well, I'm glad you asked. To answer this, I went back to look at Hughes's autobiography, The Big C, where he discusses his time as a college student at Lincoln University and taking his first visit to the South. He was invited to read his poetry for the 1927 commencement exercises at Fisk University. While in Nashville, he recalls firsthand encounters with Jim Crow segregation that supported some of the cautionary tales told to him in the North. Hughes decided to spend the remaining part of his summer traveling to other Southern cities, including Vicksburg, Mississippi, Baton Rouge, and New Orleans, Louisiana, and Mobile, Alabama. While in Mobile, Hughes ran into his friend Zora Neale Hurston, who was on her way back to the North after collecting data for her research on what would eventually become her 2018 posthumously published book, Barracoon, The Story of the Last Black Cargo, which documented the real-life account of Cujo Lewis, an enslaved man who was on the Clotilda, the last slave ship to reach America. Hughes decided to join in with Hurston on her travels because he knew that with her, it was going to be an adventure. Once leaving Mobile, both Hurston and Hughes traveled to Tuskegee Institute, where they gave writing lectures to students attending summer school. Located less than 20 miles from Hurston's birthplace in Nottasulga, Alabama, Tuskegee was a thoroughfare for Black artists and writers. On this visit, they ran into prominent Harlem Renaissance author and literary editor of The Crisis, Jessie Fawcett, who was at Tuskegee teaching summer school. Fawcett would later become a mentor of Hughes's by helping to craft his iconic writing style and voice. Documenting this trip is a 1927 photograph of Hurston, Hughes, and Fawcett standing in front of Booker T. Washington's famous monument, Lifting the Veil of Ignorance, on Tuskegee's campus. Fast forwarding to 1940, CBS Radio commissioned Langston Hughes to write a radio play about the life of Booker T. Washington based on Up From Slavery. His radio play would coincide with the national release of the Booker T. Washington postage stamp, the first time in U.S. history that an African American was featured on a stamp. The details of this event were advertised both nationally and internationally, and the press coverage featured Hughes as much as it did Washington. Hughes wrote a one-act play called Booker T. Washington in Atlanta and centered a hypothetical scenario that envisioned Washington's thoughts and conversations leading up to the moments when he delivered his famed 1895 Atlanta Exposition Address. Hughes did not merely recite Washington's account of this event in Up From Slavery or newspaper clippings. Rather, he utilized the literary techniques of flashback to switch between historical periods of Washington's life. Doing this actually humanized both Washington and the trivialized retelling of the speech. Although the title of the play is called Booker T. Washington in Atlanta, audience only experiences Washington in the actual setting of Atlanta at the very end. The majority of the play is dedicated to Washington's preparation and travels getting to the Cotton States and International Exposition. Booker T. Washington in Atlanta was originally broadcasted on the CBS radio program, The Pursuit of Happiness, on April 7, 1940. The same day of the stamp's early release in Tuskegee, Alabama. On this day, Tuskegee Institute President Dr. Frederick Douglass Patterson officially declared April 7th as Founders Day. Several news and radio outlets printed the following announcement advertising the festivities accompanying the Booker T. Washington stamp release. The announcement went as follows. Langston Hughes, famous American Negro poet, has been commissioned by Columbia Broadcasting System to write a drama based on the classic Booker T. Washington autobiography, Up From Slavery. The finished work is to star Rex Ingram in an especially prepared program for Columbia's Pursuit of Happiness, to be heard over KGLO Sunday from 3:30 to 4 p.m. This date has several important Booker T. Washington relationships, according to Pursuit of Happiness Director Norman Corwin. Dr. F.D. Patterson, president of Tuskegee Institute, Alabama, has announced April 7th as Founders Day at Tuskegee Institute. Booker T. Washington, who established the famous Negro Educational Institution in 1881, is to be honored by the United States Post Office Department by the issuance on that day of a 10-cent stamp in the famous American series. Because there is no post office in Haleford, Virginia, Washington's birthplace, the stamps are to be issued at Tuskegee on Sunday. Selection by CBS of Rex Ingram to portray the famous Negro educator is based on his world fame as a representative dramatist who, among many other great roles, was seen by millions as Dalad in the motion picture Green Pastures. He has just returned from England, where he was featured in a remake of The Thief of Baghdad. The announcement highlights the popularity of the radio shows and indicates that performers were just as important in the production. Rex Ingram, who the announcement called out, was a highly acclaimed Black actor and a trailblazing career in film, television, and Broadway. For him to be cast as Booker T. Washington denotes the star power involved in making the stamp's release memorable and a fanfare event. Langston Hughes's radio play was not the first time he wrote about Washington, however. In fact, 10 years prior, he published Alabama Earth at Booker T. Washington's grave in 1930 and Open Letter to the South, Red Flag on Tuskegee in 1932. As a politically conscious writer, Hughes often documented the evolution of the Black community through a lens of activism, politics, and migratory patterns. His poem, Alabama Earth, is a reflection of his time spent at Booker T. Washington's gravesite on the campus of Tuskegee Institute, now University. Written only 3 years after his summer trip with Zora Neale Hurston in 1927, it was an original piece for the cover of the student publication, The Tuskegee Messenger. The speaker paints a picture of pastoral nature by mentioning how the singing pines and vast skies tower above the soils and hold the body of the iconic educator. Let's listen as I read the words penned by Langston Hughes regarding Washington's gravesite. Hughes wrote, "Deep in Alabama earth his buried body lies, but higher than the singing pines and taller than the skies. And out of Alabama earth to all the world there goes the truth a simple heart has held, and the strength a strong hand knows. While over Alabama earth, these words are gently spoken. Serve, and hate will die unborn. Love, and chains are broken. To flung my arms wide in some place of the sun, to whirl and to dance till the white day is done. Then rest at cool evening beneath a tall tree while night comes on gently, dark like me. That is my dream, to fling my arms wide in the face of the sun, dance, whirl, whirl till the quick day is done. Rest at pale evening, a tall, slim tree, night coming tenderly, black like me." In the lines, "To all the world there goes the truth a simple heart has held, and the strength a strong hand knows," is a subtle reference to Booker T. Washington's mission for developing the head, hand, and heart of students, which was a core component of his industrial education curriculum and uplift strategy. The speaker imagines the ideology of Washington as a spirit soaring through the world, transforming economic, social, and educational landscapes. The legacy is then condensed to the following lines: serve and hate will die unborn. Love and chains are broken. In Alabama Earth, Hughes centralizes the physical grounds under which Washington is buried as a way for audiences to reimagine Washington's cycle of life, I argue, in two ways. One is the natural decay of his body providing literal nutrients to the soil of Alabama, and the other, a testimony to Washington's uplift legacy that harvested crops of students, community leaders, and practitioners. Essentially, I argue, this poem offers an informal eulogy for Washington and becomes a theme through which Hughes would revisit in the forthcoming decades. For Hughes, Washington's legacy was an ethereal presence, soaring higher than the singing pines and taller than the skies. However, as Hughes experienced his own personal growth, it may be argued that the ethereal presence of Washington's legacy lurked in the background, either haunting him or inspiring him. 2 years later, after Hughes's pastoral tribute to Washington in Alabama Earth, he penned his 1932 poem called Open Letter to the South, Red Flag on Tuskegee, which sharply critiqued Washington's uplift strategies and advocated a more radical approach to African American progress. Hughes wrote this piece while he himself engaged with communist ideologies. From 1941 to 1953, Langston Hughes was under FBI investigation for his associations with the Communist Party, namely for his membership in the International Union of Revolutionary Writers and his poem Goodbye Christ. However, Hughes was never convicted of any treason. During the time of release, America was steeped in a great economic depression, and the migration of Black people to northern cities had significantly slowed. Hughes contrasts the shifting times by citing the famous separate as the fingers, one as the hand excerpt from Washington's Atlanta Exposition Address. The speaker insists this ideology is antiquated, and in order to meet progress, racial unity must exist among the working class in order to challenge classism and capitalism. Listen as I read the opening lines of Red Flag on Tuskegee and how the speaker addresses his white audiences. The speaker states, white workers of the South, miners, farmers, mechanics, mill hands, shop girls, railway men, servants, tobacco workers, sharecroppers, greetings. I am the Black worker. Listen, to the land might be ours, and the mines and the factories and the office towers at Harlan, Richmond, Gastonia, Atlanta, New Orleans, that the plants and the roads and the tools of power be ours. Let us forget what Booker T said, separate as the fingers. Let us become instead, you and I, one single hand that can united rise to smash the old dead dogmas of the past, to kill the lies of color that keep the rich enthroned and thrive us to the time clock and the plow. Helpless, stupid, scattered, and alone as now. Race against race because one is Black, another white of face. The speaker's address here is reminiscent of being on stage or soapbox, delivering a message of hope to crowds of people downtrodden and overlooked by their bosses and larger corporations. You see, at this point in the 1930s, the Great Depression had struck African Americans even harder than it did whites. And not only did they lose jobs in the cities in greater numbers than did whites, but many of those who retained employment, especially in agriculture, were driven down to starvation wages. During the Depression era, which Hughes is writing, Washington was a recognized symbol for building the American economy through agriculture and labor. However, politically, his conservative methods for racial reconciliation were an approach of the past. The working class was in search of a more progressive and radical method. One such approach included siding with the Socialist Party. And for many Black leaders, socialism became a more desirable option for addressing the racial tensions in America. It wasn't until decades later that we do see Hughes reconcile his own tensions with the conservatism of the past and the legacy of Tuskegee. In his 1965 Philadelphia Tribune article, he addresses his tension with Tuskegee, but mentions how it redeemed itself in the wake of the civil rights movement. He writes, quote, "Things have changed lately. Tuskegee teachers have made a determined fight for the right to vote. Tuskegee students marched this spring on Montgomery. Maybe we can say that had Booker T. Washington never built Tuskegee, nor buttered its bread with compromise, there might be no students today in Plantation, Alabama to march on Washington," end quote. Hughes's later life reflection shows a keener understanding to the generational impact of Booker T. Washington's uplift methods. He indicates that because Washington compromised certain areas of social and political progress, his emphasis on economics and education paved a way for future generations to become more radical in their politics. In the movement for advancing the Southern working class, Hughes used Tuskegee as a focal point and imagined it as a radical site for change and racial progress. For Hughes, Tuskegee was a place where Washington's life work continued and served as a response center for American racial diplomacy. Concluding my talk, through the work of Langston Hughes, and I broadly argue in my research, other African American authors, we see where Booker T. Washington is poetically lifted up in literature and carried throughout different time periods of social and political movements. Thank you. This concludes my talk on Up From Literature, how Booker T. Washington and Tuskegee Institute influenced the Black literary tradition.